Let's throw some things and let's add a custom throwable projectile entity to our Minecraft mod. More in-depth topics for Minecraft modding available in the 121 modding courses linked below, covering writable and tameable entities, custom entity armor, and even custom entity inventories, among many more awesome topics. Alright, we're fans back and tell you once more, and in this tutorial we're going to be adding a custom throwable projectile entity. So that's quite a long name over here, but basically it's going to be a projectile that we're going to be able to throw. Now you will find that even though the actual length of this tutorial is, longer than one might expect, the actual implementation is fairly simple. Now in this case, we will be copying over quite a few things again, as is just per usual, because, well, last time, or, a couple of tutorials ago, when we've added the custom gecko entity over here, it was quite a bit of code, and while we're not going to need as much code, there's still going to be quite a bit of code. So go to the description below. There is a GitHub repository with all of the code always available to you, so you can double check that. But yeah, what are we going to add? Well, of course, we're going to add the tomahawk right here, which is going to be absolutely sick. Now, first things first, credit goes where credit is due over here. So this is done by Artkek, and that is going to be distributed under the Creative Commons license. So do also check the description. If you want to use the tomahawk and actually publish your own mod, then you will need to follow the license properly. But with that out of the way, we have two different Blockbench files that you will get in the description below as well for download. And that is the Blockbench file right here for the tomahawk, and then the tomahawk item, because one of them is going to be a custom item model that you're going to have in your hand, right? That's going to look kind of like this, right? Which is going to be really awesome. And then, of course, there's also going to be the entity itself that looks just a little bit different. So just keep that in mind. And first of all, of course, from Blockbench, we need to, well, basically get all of this exported over here. So we're going to do exactly this. So in the entity one, we're going to go to File, Project, and then here export version Forge 1.17 plus mode maps. We're going to make sure that that is correct. And then we can confirm File, Export, and then Export Java entity. This is going to be the tomahawk.java. That's going to be awesome. That is, of course, the entity model in this case. And we don't need to export the animations over here because we're going to deal with the spinning animation over here. We're going to deal with that in a different manner. Now, you could also, in theory, do it with the animation way. That also would work. But in our case, I actually wanted to do it a little bit differently. And then in the item model file over here, we're going to go to File, Export block / item model. And this is fine, tomahawk item.json, that's okay. And there we go. Now we also need actually for both of them the texture. Now, as you can see, they are slightly different. So for the tomahawk over here, right click save as, is the tomahawk PNG, that's going to be awesome. And then for the texture of the item model, right click save as, and I'm going to call this tomahawk-item over here, just so that I know that it is a different texture, and we will basically rename it once we import it into IntelliJ. With all of this exported, we are actually basically good to go, and we can start first of all by adding the item. Now, it doesn't really matter which way you go in this. You can first add the item, you can first add the entity. It doesn't really matter. I think we need to go like once around anyway, so that's gonna be okay. So in the item, we of course are gonna need a custom item class. So item custom, we're gonna right click in, make a new Java class called the tomahawk item in this case. That is correct. There we go. This will simply extend from the item class. There we go. Hover over this, create constructor matching super, and then this is super freaking simple. We're just going to have one method that we're going to overwrite. Now this I'm going to copy over. It will include an error that is basically, well, sort of predetermined right here, and that one is that the tomahawk projectile entity doesn't exist yet. Absolutely no worries, but the crazy thing about it is that this is all we need in this case. The use method, of course, gets called whenever we right-click an item of this particular type, right? So when we have a tomahawk item in our inventory, we right-click it, then this method gets called, and that one is going to spawn a projectile entity, and it's going to then, shoot that from a rotation, and there we go. Now, what you'll find here is that we're going to use the play sound of snowball throw, and if I were to, let's, for example, say press shift twice and look at the snowball item over here and include non-project items, and I were to go in here, you'll see that this is pretty much exactly the same thing. So once again, vanilla comes to the rescue. You're going to be like, how does that work? Well, take a look at vanilla. I know that I'm going to sound like a broken record over here, but man, there are so many things and so many examples in vanilla. It is actually quite amazing. With this done, we're going to keep the error right here for the time being, because we're going to, of course, register the custom entity in just a bit, but let's first of all go ahead and actually register the item. So this is going to be a public static final deferred item of type item. This is going to be the tomahawk. There we go. Equal to items dot register. This is going to be the tomahawk. There we go. And then the second parameter, a supplier of a new tomahawk item that we've just created over here with just new item properties. And I think, in my opinion, this should stack to like 16. I think that is going to be sort of an interesting, way to balance it, basically. With that one, we can add it to the creative mode tab. That would be a pretty good idea. So there's going to be the tomahawk. There we go. And then when it comes to anything else, we're going to deal with that in a second. Let's first of all then add the assets just so that we are basically done with this, and then we can only basically focus on the entity after this. So the assets, of course, is going to be number one, the translation. Here we're going to start with the item translation, and then in theory you could also add an translation here for the entity. So this would be the tomahawk right here as well. Now you don't really need that because I don't think that we're ever going to run into an issue or run into anything where we need this, but just to be sure, we could also do that. And then when it comes to the models, this is of course where we're actually going to use an item model, right? This is going to be the tomahawk item.json. So we're going to copy this over and we're going to rename this to tomahawk.json to, of course, be named the same name as we have registered it right here. And then inside of it, very, very important here, this is going to be a thing that a lot of people might forget. The texture over here, we have to specifically say this is tutorial mod : item/tomahawk over here. That is very important that we do this correctly. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And this texture, of course, is going to then be textures item. And then here you want to use the tomahawk-item PNG. Copy it over. This one is obviously the one that we have exported from Blockbench. We're going to say OK. We've renamed this to be the exact same name that we have here. And there we go. The other one is going to go under textures entity. And here a new directory called tomahawk. There we go. And there's going to be the tomahawk PNG. And we're also going to copy this one over. There we go. And that should actually be everything in terms of the assets. So we don't even need to go down to the resources anymore. And we can basically then now focus solely on actually adding the tomahawk entity. Now that one is, as I said, semi-complicated, but you will see that luckily there's, quite a few things that are going to be sort of easily explained. Entity, custom, and here we're going to make the tomahawk projectile entity. There we go. Crazy name of the class, but there we go. Now this will extend from the abstract arrow class, and the reason for this is going to get apparent in a second. We're going to hover over this to implement the get default pickup item method. We're going to hover over this again, create constructor matching super. Here we're just going to choose the first one because we'll need to make 2 custom constructors anyway. So this is going to be the first one. I'm going to make this public over here. That's going to be fine. And then we're going to make a second constructor, and that's going to be the tomahawk projectile entity, passing in living entity called shooter here in this case, and then the level, making sure we choose net Minecraft world level over here. And there we go. Here we're then going to call the super. First parameter is going to be empty. Second parameter shooter, then level, then a new item stack of mod items.tomahawk.get. And then after the second closing parentheses, a null over here, because we don't fire this particular entity from a weapon, we actually just throw it. Therefore, the fire from a weapon is simply a null in this case. We're also going to need 2 custom fields. This is going to be a private float called rotation. I'm going to explain both of those in a second when we get to them. And then a vec2, very important vec2, which is going to be the grounded offset. And we're going to explain that one as well. The thing here in the super is, of course, going to be the entity type that we have to get from the mod entities, but we can only get that once the tomahawk is actually registered. So we're going to get that in a second. Here in the get default pickup, very straightforward, new item stack of mod items.tomahawk.get. Easy enough. And then we get some custom methods. So I'm going to copy over, first of all, the first 3 methods. This is going to be the get rendering rotation, the is grounded, and the on hit entity method. So, and then I'm going to explain. The get rendering rotation, we're going to need that in a second. We're going to need that for the custom renderer so that the rotation of the entity basically, well, gets smoothly done, right? So we have this entity, we basically want it to properly rotate like this when it's flying, and that is basically what this method over here does. Is grounded basically is just needed so that the in-ground Boolean over here from the abstract arrow can actually be accessed outside of this class. So that's just sort of a helper method. And then the onEntity hit. I feel like that should be kind of self-explanatory. The basic idea is that this method gets called when this particular entity hits another entity, and then it basically damages that entity by whatever amount you want. You can, of course, then also change this. Feel free to play around with this. Also take a look at the super over here, right? The onHitEntity method over here in the abstract arrow class. Always highly recommended. And then there you go. And then one last method that is going to be it's not a custom one, but the contents are custom. That's going to be the onHitBlock method. And that is going to look kind of like this. Now, what you'll see here is that we have this grounded offset over here, which is the vector 2. And we set this depending on what side of the block you hit, basically with this entity. And the reason why that is the case is because when the entity flies away, right, and then it hits a block, it doesn't matter in like where it hits it, but the idea is that if it hits a block, and the block is going to look kind of like this. Let me just like get a block over here. And the block is whatever it might be. This is the block, right? It hits. Then obviously what you want is basically always that the entity looks kind of like this inside of the block, right? And that is, of course, going to be different if it hits the block from this side versus if the block is all of a sudden here, right? And then all of a sudden we need to like rotate this around. And that's basically what the vec2 does, right? The grounded offset basically makes sure that the end position of the tomahawk inside of a block is correct. That's basically what this does. Are there different ways to do it? Absolutely. Is this sometimes going to look a little bit weird? Also, absolutely. If you want to change this, you are, of course, free to do so. Implement this particular entity and then change this around however you would like. That is basically the ideal version of how you can use the tutorials as well, right? You take what I've made over here and you're like, I don't like this. Let's change it up. Absolutely go for it. With this done, we have the tomahawk projectile entity pretty much to the point where we can go into our mod entities class and actually register it. So there's going to be a public static final supplier, of course, of type entity type of type tomahawk projectile entity. It's going to be our tomahawk. There we go. Equal to entity types dot register. And here this is the tomahawk. And then this is going to be a supplier of entity type dot builder dot of. And then we're going to pass in the tomahawk projectile entity : new mob category of miscellaneous. After the first closing parenthesis, a sized. Now the size here is going to be 0.05 and 1.15. And then after the first closing parenthesis, again, a build with a key for the tomahawk right here. Now you'll find that we're going to get an error right here in the constructor. Now, you may or may not have run into this before when you make a projectile entity or a non-mob entity, non-creature entity. And the way to fix this is some voodoo magic Java stuff. I have no idea why this works or what exactly it does, but basically what you're going to do is in the builder.of, after the dot and exactly before the of, you want to put in the angled brackets. So basically to signify, hey, this is some sort of generic. And inside you want to pass in tomahawk projectile entity. And then all of a sudden it works. This is a very weird syntax to me. I still don't quite understand why this works. I mean, most likely what it's going to do is going to say, hey, use a particular, one of the particular constructors instead of the other. Fair enough. But yeah, still, it's kind of weird, but this is how it works. And when you do this, then it works. When we can then go back to the projectile entity class over here inside of the constructor and say mod entities dot tomahawk dot get. Awesome. Now this class is done. We can close this. We can close this class, and we can go back to the item over here and actually import the tomahawk projectile entity. And now the tomahawk item class is also done. And we are basically left with, well, two different classes that we need to do. And that is going to be the model as well as the renderer. So in the entity client package, we're going to right click new Java class called the tomahawk projectile model. And of course, as well, in the client package, tomahawk projectile renderer. There we go. We're going to start with the model, as this is the class that we've exported, or yeah, basically exported from Blockbench. In this case, I'm going to copy over the contents of the class, right? So without the curly brackets, so everything that is within the curly brackets right here. And then we'll see. We're going to import the model location, resource location, the model part over here. and we're just going to import all of the different classes that we need for the time being, and then we're going to fix all of the issues that might arise. So nothing too crazy. There we go. And then the mesh definition. Awesome. I'm going to change the name of the constructor right here to, of course, the name of the class. The class itself will also extend from not from the entity renderer. It's actually going to be from the entity model of type tomahawk projectile entity in this case. And then here we're going to change the setup anim method tomahawk projectile entity. We're going to import the post stack and the vertex consumer, and the last 4 floats are going to change to an integer called color. And then here we're just going to pass in that color as well. That is pretty much all we need. And that is actually all we need to do. The model location, of course, we need to change to resource location.from namespace and path. And then the mod ID, of course, is going to be tutorial mod.modid. Tomahawk is fine. Layer main is awesome. That is actually all we need in this case for the projectile model. Pretty freaking neat, right? There's no animations. There's no particular root or anything that we need. This is all that is in the model. And the renderer, that is a little more complicated, but not to worry. Now, the renderer is going to extend from the entity renderer of type tomahawk projectile entity. Then we're going to hover over this to implement the get texture location method. Hover over this again, create constructor matching super, and that is actually fine. I'm going to make this public. And then here, it's actually quite important. We need to have a private, and this is a tomahawk projectile model. So we need to make the model custom, more or less, like inside of here. And we need to then say this.model inside of the constructor, of course, is equal to a new tomahawk projectile model, passing in context.bake layer, and this would be in the tomahawk projectile model as well, layer location, and there we go. With this, that's awesome. When it comes to the texture location, I think I don't need to expand too much on this. We've added this before, right? So the texture that we've literally added over here in the entity over here, there we go. That it points to this one. Don't forget the .png. That's always very important and a very easy thing to miss, basically. And then I'm going to copy over the render method. Now here we need the render method, and you will see that overall it's not too crazy. Most of this is sort of taken once again also from the arrow, I believe even. But the idea here is that there are 2 different ways that what we're doing, right? So we're basically changing the rotation if we're grounded and if we're not grounded. So if we're not grounded, then you can see that depending on the get rendering rotation, we're continuously rotating this on the positive x-axis. Now, if we were to look over here, the positive x-axis, so x is red, so that would be this red one right here, and we're going to go positive, and that would be this direction. So this is the way that it's going to rotate. That is going to look pretty freaking sick. Now, that is going to happen until we are grounded. And when we're grounded, then I want the rotation over here to be set to y and x offsets. And the offset, of course, is dependent upon what side of a block I hit. And that's basically all that there is to it. And that is the idea of like this particular entity renderer. Now, is this the best way to do it? I genuinely don't know. Of course, it might be better to actually rotate the entity itself instead of rotating it only sort of in the renderer. But this is the way that I found this to be, fairly straightforward in my opinion. Once again, opinions may differ, which is totally fine, right? And you can, of course, also check this out and try it out for yourself. I always recommend doing that as well. With that, though, we have pretty much everything we're going to need. As per usual, of course, all of the code is available to you down below. And now we just need to connect everything over here via the mod events over here. So this is going to be the first one is the register layers. So this is going to be the tomahawk projectile model.layer location. This is, of course, then also going to be the tomahawk projectile model. There's no attributes. There's no spawn placements because, well, the actual thing does not spawn. So the last one is in the tutorial mod class at the bottom over here for the entity renderers. Entity renderers.register mod entities tomahawk, and then that is going to be for the tomahawk projectile renderer : new. And with this, I think we actually have everything we're going to need. Now, once again, it's not super straightforward, as in like it's like you add this in like 5 minutes, but when you look at it, each one of the classes is not too bad, specifically compared to like say the gecko entity, where there's definitely a bit more things that are needed to be added. But with this done, what we can do is simply jump into the game and see if it works. All right, fans, I was back in Minecraft, and as you can see, the tomahawk has been successfully added to the game, and now I can throw it around, and you can see it rotates around, which looks, I mean, pretty sick. And you can see that when it hits a block, it's going to stick inside of it, and we can even pick it up again. And you can see, depending on the side it hits, it's going to snap a little bit weirdly. This is what I said, that it sometimes might look weird, because if I throw it like, specifically on the ground, right? So it's going to stick like this. So if I throw it like this, then it might look a little bit strange. But overall, right, in total, it looks pretty freaking cool. Like when you throw it around, and of course, we can try to hit an entity, and that will also work totally fine. That is, in my opinion, really freaking cool. And yeah, that is custom throwable projectile entities added to Minecraft. Awesome. And that's going to be it for this tutorial right here. Next time in this video, we'll talk about a custom boss bar. Hope to see you there. So, yeah.